we understand what the clinicians are thinking, saying, doing, and we can lend that expertise to the research team to help them sort of evolve with that discussion.
Welcome to Transforming Medical Communications, a podcast by MedComms experts. We share medical communications insights and advice from the best and brightest in the industry to find out what they're doing to push our industry forward. Here's your host, Wesley Portegies.
Welcome to Transforming Medical Communications, the podcast where we explore bold ideas shaping the future of medical affairs. I'm really excited that we're joined today by Sheffler-Collins, who is the Director of Scientific Communications and Content at Astellas. And with over 13 years of experience in medical communications, Sean is a specialist in creating cohesive pipeline narratives and aligning cross-functional teams to communicate therapeutic area leadership effectively. In this episode, we're diving into Sean's approach to creating these cohesive therapeutic area narratives and how medical affairs orchestrates the strategy and the value of storytelling and gaining trust among audiences. Sean, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot. Very excited to be here today.
Glad to have you. Sean, maybe to open the floor here, what was your driving force behind your decision to specializing in medical communications, and how did you go about that transition?
Sure. Yeah, so while I was in grad school, I realized that I was not interested in staying as a bench scientist. And so I was exploring different potential fields and opportunities. And I also thought a lot about what did I enjoy in my career. And I think I really liked presenting data, writing, reading, and working with others. So I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to find a MedComms job right out of grad school. So I just sort of took a plunge, and one of the things that really helped me was that my background was in neuroscience, and the first job was within Alzheimer's therapy. So that sort of made an easier transition as I began to learn, what medical communications was. And, I really enjoyed it. And that sort of was my starting point for, hopefully, already quite a bit of time and hopefully many more years to come in MedComms.
Amazing. Well, I wish you the same. So we're going to talk about therapeutic area narratives today. And I was wondering, could you, in very simple terms, explain what this means? What is a therapeutic area narrative?
Sure. So, the therapeutic area narrative is creating a cohesive story that matches both the assets that are in the development pipeline with some of the, approved products, and trying to teach someone externally, what the company is sort of all about. So in my experience, this was a lot about oncology and understanding, this whole pipeline of different compounds, where they fit in, and, where Astellas is working, as well as, where we're going as a company from a research perspective.
So you're saying, like, in the typical setup, we have a company may have like a portfolio of products that in the same therapeutic area. All of those products typically have their own narrative, and this is kind of the umbrella narrative that talks about the company's positioning in that particular therapy area. Is that how I should understand this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a great way to say it. And so, thinking about, oncology is a big field. So thinking about sort of, where is the company going, and, also understanding with clinicians. So if there's someone who's treating patients with prostate cancer, understanding, would they potentially be interested in collaborating, having patients be involved in a clinical trial, understanding, what new therapies might be coming. So trying to engage with them and hopefully, get their interest, and also understand sort of what we're doing and where we're going, hopefully.
Yeah, that makes sense. So why is this important? Let's start with that. What would happen if a company wouldn't have one?
At this point in time, there is we're really fighting for attention. So I think one of the key things is, we have about a minute or so of someone's time, and we want to make sure that they understand. I think of something like at a Congress where there's hundreds of different booths and hundreds of different companies. If, we're lucky enough to have someone walk by, I'd like them to know within that minute, what does Astellas stand for? What are we trying to do? And they can see whether or not that's interesting to them. So I think without a story, you might see lots of compounds with a bunch of different letters and numbers, and you don't understand what are they doing, where might you fit in? So hopefully it's a touch point where a clinician or another stakeholder could see, okay, here's a company I've never heard of. What are they doing? Does it relate to something I'm interested in? Or if not, that's also okay, and move on to someone who might be of more interest. But I think there's also a way in which companies sometimes think about like their technology, or they think about, a lot of other factors versus, what is the actual story, right? What are you actually hoping to accomplish? I mean, ultimately, every drug company that's out there is, hoping to treat patients in a way that will benefit them. But what is different between all these different companies, and, where could you, again, making that decision, who to pay attention to, what makes sense, and where do you want to learn more, I think is another key area where hopefully, hopefully you're interested in what, I'm working on, what I have to say, and then we can hopefully build a relationship from that.
Yeah, so basically this is I guess driving awareness among healthcare professionals that a company is active in a particular therapy area, which typically spans then across those different products, right? So like I don't know, like musculoskeletal disorders, right? Or neuromuscular disorders or something. And as a physician, you would know like, oh yeah, I know like this company is active there, and I wouldn't be like surprised perhaps to see you with a booth at a conference. But then within that portfolio, there's of course multiple elements. So that's what you're saying, right?
Right. No, exactly. And, I would hope if you have that touch point and you're interested in it, you would see, okay, they have some data. I'll go consider their poster, or I might have a patient who might be a good candidate for a clinical trial, or they might be leading an educational program, or, whatever sort of point. It's really just sort of opening the door to start a conversation and to see, again, does this make sense? Could we work together? Do I have something that you would be interested in learning more about? And I think when it fits well and when it's a good audience, then, then it's an opportunity to have a discussion. And, there are, which is good. I mean, there's a lot of companies, there's a lot of new therapies. We are sort of competing for patients to enroll in our trials, and we're competing for attention, and we want we want people to interact with us and see our data, hear our keep an eye on what's happening, and consider working with us. I think that's sort of the ultimate goal, is that we want to have healthcare professionals who are engaged and that we can continue to work with, and have that sort of give or take relationship where we work together. We have people who give us advice, work with our trials, work with interact with our publications, whatever sort of aspect they're interested in. We want to work together. That's what we're looking.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So like basically, in order, if you want them to become like collaborators, you better have, I guess, some kind of reputation in that particular therapy area, which does not necessarily need to relate to one particular therapy within that area, but could basically be more across those different products, right? So now,
And, from the company perspective, they may want to consider, we may be thinking about therapy in a totally different area, and we want to figure out, who has expertise, who would consider working with us, or we or it may be, entrenched, and we want to say, okay, we think this is the new generation of therapies for, like you were saying, musculoskeletal disorder. Like we have an idea, we have a new hypothesis of a new type of treatment, and we'd like to work with you. We'd like to understand whether it's a good idea, whether we're looking at the right patients, whether we're designing trials, all sorts of information that's always benefited by that collaboration.
absolutely. So I would like to delve more into like how you can achieve that. But before we talk about the how, I would actually like to talk about the who. So, for me as an agency leader, I work with so many different people in the industry. But when I'm just thinking about it, I don't think I've ever encountered anyone like focusing on this in particular. Most people I speak with, I would say, are responsible for a product, right? Typically from the medical affairs side. So who in the organization is typically accountable for doing this, if anyone?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that is, as you're saying, it is often a gap. And I think it is a nice place for medical affairs to be involved and sort of be that bridge between the research and development and the clinical development team. And, they're very focused on generating the data, enrolling patients, trying to bring therapies, to regulators and progress. And I think we have a really good position in that to stop and think, okay, we know what happens with products that are approved, and to bring that expertise in. And I think it's a best practice early on to think about, especially once you start to have some clinical data and you're thinking about, okay, we have data, we want to present it. And you really want to think about, when this is the first impression, what do you want to do? What do you want to say? Who do you want to reach? Who do you want to communicate with? And that's where I think medical affairs, medical communications is really well suited. Also, to your point, in my role, I don't just have one compound, I have the whole pipeline. And so that also gives a unique perspective where I can see what's happening between different compounds and think about what's similar. And, we also have to think about, if we have other therapies, other products, how do we want to think about them together? How do they fit together? Are they serving similar patients, different patients? And so in that way, we're sort of unique. And one of our other partners who I hadn't really worked with before I did the pipeline was that sort of the corporate communications team was the other group who was working in a similar way in communicating what the pipeline is to investors and other stakeholders. And that's where I found a really productive collaboration with them, where, our audience is slightly different, but also what we want to say is really along similar lines, because we want external people to understand what the company's doing, where it's going, and hopefully to be excited about, where we're going, what our assets are, and hopefully get excited about one of them, and want to learn more, I think is the goal.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, so thanks for clarifying that. That's extremely helpful to know. And it's in particular, the takeaway for me here is like, it's the people responsible for pipeline and pipeline communications that would typically then, be doing this, right? And, now we've clarified that. Like, can you tell me a little bit more about like what are like very high level, I guess like the three major steps you need to take to develop a therapeutic area narrative, and maybe assume a situation where it's currently non-existent, right? So let's say there's a company, they have a few compounds in a therapy area, but they haven't really taken this step yet. How would that look like?
Right. So I think the first step is just having a lot of internal discussions and finding out, as you said, sort of who are the stakeholders, right? Who are we actually working with? Is it, so for instance, like I said, corporate communications was someone that I hadn't thought about. There's also, the head of like oncology research and some of our heads of the whole, like our development head is another person. So thinking about them as stakeholders. And then, so I say step one is figure out who they are. Step two would be have a discussion with them. And you always want to bring to that discussion ideas for them to engage with. You don't want to just walk in and say, so what do you think about our research in this area? But, sort of build a straw man for them, say, this is what I was thinking. Is that along the right lines, or what am I missing? Where do we sort of need to go? And then, I think the next step would just be creating a short story. Now that could be like a 1-page, type document, or it could be a slide or two. I think from my own experience, one thing that we did was I just had like an image of the human body, and I was trying to put our different assets on different parts of the body and seeing which ones might overlap. And that was sort of a starting point for me, just to say, okay, we see that these are focused in a similar area, and how do we sort of divide that up? Because again, I mean, a lot of these pipeline assets may have very high potential, and there may be, scientific reasons or business reasons why they get explored in a specific way. And you want to talk to the stakeholders to understand sort of the logic behind it and where it's going. And then, I see our role as being the one to put it back together, right? Getting those insights, and then we're the communicators. We want to put it together into the story so that we can then it can be used and shared. And obviously, as one of the key things is that we want to have a consistent voice from all of our internal stakeholders whenever they're interacting with someone, because a lot of times we're interacting with the same people. So we don't want to tell them different things. We want to tell them the same information.
Is MedComms evolving faster than your team can keep up? You're not alone, and you don't have to navigate it alone. Wesley Portegies, host of Transforming Medical Communications, is offering a limited number of free 30-minute consultancy sessions for medical affairs professionals. Whether it's medical communications, field medical, or medical affairs training, these sessions provide an opportunity to address your real-world challenges, pressure test ideas, and walk away with practical strategic insight for your team. No fluff, just strategy. Follow the on-screen link or in the show notes to book your free session now.
Yeah. Consistency is so important when communicating, both internally and externally. I couldn't agree more. So, and that actually leads me kind of to my next question. How do you make sure that the people working on the product level are aware of the therapeutic area narrative, and how can they actually use it in their day-to-day?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think like anything, the key is building relationships and communicating with them. So the only way that they know it exists is if you tell them and you continue to work with them and make sure they're aware. So like for me, I would do things like send out a monthly newsletter or send out other, quarterly updates, monthly newsletters, different types of information, just to make sure that people know who I am, what I'm doing, and this is the story. Now, I think another key point for us on the pipeline is at big scientific congresses, especially ones that are crossing different therapy areas, like an ASCO or some other meeting where there's lots of different parts coming together at one big meeting, or a big neurology meeting, something where there's different types of people and they come together, and that's another key touch point to make sure. And again, that's also a time where internally people are coming together and thinking about, we have pre-conference meetings, we have a booth, we have these KOL interactions, we have all different things that are happening. So sort of inserting myself into those planning meetings, those activities, and making sure that the team does. Now, again, and I can't speak for every company, but usually there's, sort of a core team for each asset, and making sure that you have regular interactions with the lead of that team, just to make sure that they're aware of you and seeing, for me, it's a lot about thinking about how can I help, right? What can we do? And checking in a lot about, do they have data? Because I think data is a great point for communication activities to think about. Okay, we have something new. What do we want to say? How do we want to say it? And what is our objective of that, right? The point of the data is not just we have it and we want to publish it or we want to present it, but the point is that we have something that we want to say. And I think a lot for the pipeline, a lot of that can be really focused on the mechanism of action and thinking about how you would frame that. So that's a point that I think is really good. And again, it's a point that changes from the preclinical research as they get into clinical data to say, okay, we think this asset may work in a couple different ways, but then want to make sure that we're proving it in human patients that that's true. And so, for instance, one asset that I've been working on, we think there may be a direct mechanism, they may be an indirect mechanism through the immune system. There's different ways it could be working, and to parse out what are the effects and understand what they are, and then how would you describe it to someone, again, because you may be pushing together many different scientific hypotheses. So you want to clarify that in a way that someone can understand and know, okay, this molecule is doing this thing. You want to get it to that point, the same way as on the investor call, they may say, this is whatever, a beta 2 antagonist, right? That's it. That's all you get. So you want to make sure that you can pin it down into something concise and understandable, so that someone can recognize what it is. And for me, and the booth has been a great example, one of the things we spent a lot of time on for the booth was drawing mechanism of actions of different compounds. And so that was a great way to talk about with the team, this is what your data said. I tried to draw it. Is this accurate? Or how can we modify it in a way that will communicate, what we hope it's doing to a patient? And I think that was another great, to get back to the sort of bigger therapeutic area narrative. As we put these different mechanisms together, we wanted to do them in a way that was similar, and to think about how is this mechanism similar to other compounds, and how can we show them in a way that might be similar, so that you will understand some of the similarities and differences between different compounds.
Absolutely. So would you be able to give me an example of a success story, right? A success story where having a well-defined therapeutic area narrative for the organization really paid off.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think from my opinion, obviously I'm a little biased because I worked on it, but I think, you know, where I really thought about it was in terms of that pipeline booth and putting materials together. And, you know, prior to my time, a lot of our booth was very focused on different assets in different stages and different mechanisms or modalities for them, whether it's a monoclonal antibody, small molecule, whatever it might be. And so one of the things that I think we did successfully in creating the pipeline booth was putting all the assets back together, as I said, like trying to put them on a body, trying to think about which ones are targeting similar types of cancers, and then moving them in that direction, creating the mechanism of actions together, and then putting it together into the booth so that someone could come and interact with it, and also repackaging that material in for MSL content to use them with the asset team so that they could use our mechanism of action when they talk to investigators and other people, when the market access team talks to payers. So, taking the pipeline, trying to put it into a way that makes sense for the booth, and then sort of reusing all that work that went into it to maximize into other types of assets so that other stakeholders can use it, and also that it's all with that sort of consistent voice, consistent visualization, so that you hopefully are thinking about it in the way that I'm thinking about it too, where the pieces are fitting together into a larger puzzle, not just sort of individual things laying around.
So it sounds to me that a lot of different people and groups are involved, right? And in our recent medical communications landscape survey that we did among the industry, the actual number one priority and hurdle that was reported was cross-functional alignment. So I can only imagine that this is kind of tough to achieve. When it comes to that kind of cross-functional collaboration that you will need to have to get here, are there any examples of tools or resources that really helped you doing this, or frameworks for that matter, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I was saying before, I think one good thing to do is to take a step back and think about who are your stakeholders, right? And they may be different than you think, because I have my own manager and I'm part of my own medical affairs team, but you want to step back and think about who are the stakeholders, and also who is the audience, right? So again, externally, within the company, there's all these different people doing different things, but ultimately we're all sort of talking to the same HCPs. And so we want to think about the HCPs as our audience. And then we want to think about, okay, who from our internal team is actually thinking about these external communications, and we want to work with them. And then we can use other people on the team. Like, we may, for instance, a mechanism of action, like we want to talk to bench scientists to make sure that they're happy with that mechanism, but they're not our key stakeholder who's defining the narrative. We want to leverage the expertise of individual people within the team, but keep it at sort of a higher level in terms of this story that we're trying to tell. Because, as you were saying, everyone is busy. They have a lot else going on. This is, even though I'm spending all day thinking about this, they have a lot of other goals and objectives. So want to find a way to work with them. And for me, I found that getting everyone, all the stakeholders together into a workshop or something is really valuable. I mean, it's very hard to schedule, and it's hard to get, probably can only get about 2 hours of everyone's time, but really, really making sure that you have everyone in that virtual room together, focused on this one task for a short time, I think is extremely valuable. And you, as everything, a lot of priorities, you send something around, somebody opens it, somebody doesn't, people say they don't know where, but really, stopping, having a workshop where you have a very clear agenda and realistic expectations of what we're gonna accomplish. And I think I got some really good feedback from that clinical development team that they never really sat down and thought about, what do we want to communicate, right? They never actually thought about that, because that's not really their job. So they hadn't thought about, like, what do we actually want to say? And it brought up a lot of really good discussions, disagreements, ways to think about what is the story, what is the positioning, and working through that with the team, I found really exciting. And putting into my own medcoms perspective, bias, then I can take it and create, try and create a lexicon, trying to create a basic communication platform, think about a publication strategy. But that's sort of my post-meeting work. I think the key thing is really just getting everyone there and focused on a specific task to really maximize, what do you need from them? And I found that extremely productive. And in my experience, a lot of that isn't really happening until, late phase 2 timeframe, where they're, working toward designing a phase 3 study, or they're working towards an approval, and all this information is already out there. There are already publications. People are already enrolling patients. They have endpoints, but they haven't, just taken a pause and stopped and thought, okay, what do we actually want to say? How do we want other people to see us, see our molecule, and see our company? And I think that is a really valuable thing to do. So I would really recommend having a workshop. And I think for the pipeline assets, it's a good thing maybe once a year or so, just to stop and see, can I get the team together? Or if it's broader, can I get all the people who are working on prostate cancer together and see, okay, we said these things last year, is that still true? Or what has changed? What is the data telling us? Where do we want to go? And obviously the therapeutic landscape changes, treatment guidelines change, and we just want to think about, are we still sort of on track? Does what we said last year still make sense, or do we want to change it? And then I think also, in terms of assets maturing, it's really helpful to, as you get data, to build upon it. So, we said we were hoping this would happen, but when you get the actual data, what does it mean? What does the safety profile look like? What sort of information might be available in terms of dosing or convenience, or, other things you wouldn't necessarily think about. And how do you put that into your story? And how do you sort of enrich the story, again, in that broader company context of, we have these different compounds that are maturing at different times, often in a similar area. So, do they make sense? Which asset should be a first-line therapy and which one should be a combination therapy, or for a different population? And, having those discussions and thinking about that, I think is really beneficial. And you just sort of build a richer story as you go on. And sometimes in the course of the year, the asset, has failed, and the team disbands and moves on to something else. So I think you always want to have that dialogue and those touch points, and just making sure that everyone stays on track. Because I think, again, everyone is busy and not thinking about what we're hoping to communicate. And so we want to have that sort of specific lens. And I think that's where medical affairs, medical communications has the value, because we understand what the clinicians are thinking, saying, doing, and we can lend that expertise to the research team to help them sort of evolve with that discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for such a thoughtful and detailed answer on that. I think it's very useful for our listeners to understand how to go about it, and also how to tackle the cross-functional challenge that a lot of people seem to be dealing with right now. Sean, I had so much fun discussing this topic with you. It's an extremely interesting topic, and I can definitely see how this can benefit so many different companies. And ultimately for the betterment of the industry and how we communicate to our audiences, HCPs and patients among them, right? So thank you so much for your time here today and sharing your insights. It was absolutely a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. It's great talking with you.
Transforming Medical Communications is brought to you by MedCom Experts. To find out more about MedCom's experts and how we create some of the most cutting-edge medical communications programs anywhere in the world, visit med-experts.com. And then make sure to search for Transforming Medical Communications in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at MedCom's Experts, thanks for listening.